The one I just did that had nothing to do with code quality, but it was seriously entertaining. I'm going to try to entertain you in a totally different way. I can't compete with him. He's from New York. I haven't gotten to Columbia. I know how fast New Yorkers talk, and I've just lost my mojo living in Portland, Oregon. So here I am. I'm going to talk at a normal human speed. Okay, so a good friend of mine, Carlos Gastrin, you might have heard of him. He's been all over the press lately for his work with Decode and GraphLab and that. Recently stated when he was visiting Intel that he believes that there's a huge number of intelligent applications out there. And we all know how machine learning has exploded. And next we'll come back to artificial intelligence as well. And I share his sentiment that it's likely that in 5 years, every important application out there will have a form of intelligence at its core, and that's built on the principles of machine learning and data science that we've been talking about here at the conference. And because of that, my team got really interested in this black box at the end of our necks called the brain, and how it processes information, knowing that we can learn a lot from that. It's amazing how complex the brain is. It's daunting in its scale and its number of connections. It would be hard to build a network that represented the brain today. We wouldn't know how. It would take switches, computers that are connected to tens of thousands of other computers, and literally billions of computers to do it. It'll be interesting to see where the Human Brain Project and these big White House initiatives and European initiatives go in the next 10 years. It's hard to imagine them really figuring out this black box in a way that can provide machine intelligence, since we can't even figure out how to do it with a 313 neuron nematode. Okay, so let's try a little human experiment here. Are you game? So I've got a little, this is not a very good screen, and I've got a little clip here of some buildings and a car and some people on the street. And I have a question for you. All right, good. So that was it. But first, I have to get you to close your eyes. So, this is unfortunate, the room is a little bit imbalanced, but let's have the right-hand side over here, this side over here. Close your eyes for a second. On the other side, pay attention. That's your cue. Okay, now you guys close your eyes on this side. You on the right-hand side, open them. All right, good. Don't cheat. There's your cue. Okay, let's take a look at that clip again. Okay. Raise your hand if you notice the building had completely disappeared. Did you notice it? Did you notice the building had completely switched? Here, watch. That's actually how it started. Also, by the way, the people. Did you know anybody notice the people disappear? Ah, okay. You know, all the hands on that side of the room. I don't know why the building didn't work. Maybe I miscued you guys, but you guys got the people cue, right? No? Okay, everybody else got it, but it was like there was like one hand over here, the cheater, and then everybody else had hand over there. So this makes an important point about how the mind works. Attention is a limited resource. It's a resource that you control. There is a bunch of circuits that are pre-wired in your brain. You just met me today. Many of you just met me today, and there's no. If we were to slice and dice your brain up right now, we wouldn't see the connections that represent me in your memory, even if you put it in there ultimately long term. So it's just standing electrical patterns right now that are doing that. Attention allows you to steer the spotlight of your mind around and make connections dynamically when you need to. So when I ask you to recall something, like recall what we just went through there, or what your cue was, or to do a math problem, you have to steer attention around the brain and control that. That's been one of the things that we're interested in on my team in exploring with Princeton. And in fact, we're interested in how we can understand these forms of human intelligence I'll go into in a minute, how they would bear on machine intelligence, and then likewise, how machine learning can help us better understand human intelligence. So this is a very interesting process and interaction between these two things. And that requires us to bring machine learning scientists, computer scientists, and neuroscientists together. Now, I'm sure that you've heard of all the brain-inspired computing that's going on, all the machine learning around it, and deep learning is blown up. There's a lot of that going on at the structure-inspired level. So, new models for neurons and spiking neurons and neurons that do different types of statistical averages and functions on inputs, and networks of neurons, all the things that LeCun and Hinton and everybody have been doing. These are network topologies of these neurons. And of course, architectures like the Human Brain Project that I mentioned previously, which puts these subsystems of neural networks together into some model of the human brain, hopefully, if they get it right. But what's missing in this conversation are what we've learned from psychology and cognitive neuroscience, a completely different type of neuroscience, and how the brain operates at that level. And these things have to come together. So there is, I'll admit right up front that there's probably not a literal duality of the brain and between the mind and the brain, but we're ignoring a lot of information about what we understand of the brain if we look only at the structure of the brain, and we ignore the electrical patterns and how the brain changes over time and what causes that. So here's an example of a place where I've just recently, like this comes from a paper that just got released to the Cornell Archive on November 7th, so this is like hot off the press. And I looked it up because I had the pleasure of listening to Alex Smoligan's talk at the ML conference earlier this week. I don't know if anybody was at the machine learning conference earlier. Did you hear Alex's talk then? Yeah, probably. So it was fascinating because he gave an example of how that low-level structure-inspired learning can be brought together with something like attention. And here's the example. So I'm going to show you the network in a second, but what it's doing is basically you take an original image like the dogs in the basket on the left, and you ask the question of like what are sitting in the basket on a bicycle. And the first level of this network's job is to identify the bicycle and things connected to it. So you can see the bright areas, the things that are overweighted by the network during that training process, and the black, the things that it's going to ignore. The second level network, the second level attention network, brings attention then, once it's identified the parts of the bike, including the basket, to what's in the basket. And then you can run a query on that, in that new limited context, and get a very accurate answer. Maybe you could ask, like, what's the color of the thing in the basket, or what are the objects in the basket? In this case, we see their dogs. So this is a very interesting network, and I can't wait to see where they actually published it, but this stacked attention network maybe shows the future of where cognitive neuroscience and these deep neural networks are going to come together. And I'm working with Princeton on another one that's got a task representation-based objective to it. In other words, being able to kind of retune the network based on the task it's trying to perform dynamically. And but I can see some analogy between our work already and this work that was just recently published. And so you can see, for example, in this diagram of the network that they're training on one of these, those convolutional neural networks. The output of that is given to, the question is put in the CNN and LSTM, and then that output is used to select features from the image that is also processed by a CNN, a different CNN, and then the output based on that query is brought to another attention layer, which then further provides additional features to the image CNN and so on, and it keeps going through that until we can apply it to a softmax classifier. All right, but it doesn't stop with attention. Attention is just one example of how cognitive-inspired learning may work its way into machine intelligence soon. Another example would be reinforcement learning. Here, that's been using machine learning for a long time, used for driving cars and learning how to play chess and tic-tac-toe. But here's an example of what we understand about the cognitive neuroscience with that problem. So this trace on the left is a trace from a primate. And what it shows at the top is that there's a spike in dopamine when there's a reward given. You see it, the R. And then you can train a correlation with the primate so that when you give it a stimulus, like a bell, this should remind you of some very old psychological experiments. You can see there's a dopamine spike when the stimulus is given in anticipation of the award. So now the primate is predicting the reward. And then the last trace is really interesting. It shows again the presentation of the stimulus, but where there's no reward given. And what happens, what's really interesting about this is that you can see actually a reduction in dopamine, a suppression of it there, where it's learning that perhaps it's not going to get a reward when the stimulus is given. This is relearning, in the other direction of reinforcement, or de-reinforcing. So, we don't really have networks that do that today. We don't think of neural networks that do that today. This may be one, and by the way, that dip is at the point in time where it expected the reward. So there's time-based learning built into this as well. We just don't do that with networks today. So that's an interesting thing. Another one would be selective forgetting. So networks that, if I give you a series of images, A, B, C, and these are actually in a pattern where A, B is repeated, and you can see that with the first line and the second line. We see two faces and then some other category. I can show you that that I can actually selectively make you forget an image if I later test you randomly on your recall of the image by giving you patterns like this where I prime you with two images you expect in sequence and you're expecting another third one. And sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. So what the human brain does with that is says, forget it. I'm not going to worry about the third thing in sequence. I'm going to forget about that. That's noise. And then you can prove that even though I would like you to recall that third image, you won't. Where in other cases, you might actually remember more strongly an image that's just randomly presented out of sequence. So it's interesting how a sequence with a surprise in it can suppress memory, whereas a completely random sequence is less likely to suppress memory. So we really don't understand a lot about contextual memory and recall. We don't understand selective forgetting. And that's something we should work on. And then finally, this final example I give you is robust decision making. So it's really interesting. You can model how fast someone will make a decision and what kind of risk they're willing to take for the reward. And in this case, this is a network where there's two competing neurons, or set of neurons that are, one is looking for able to detect objects that are moving to the left on the screen, which is in left in blue, for example, and the red one is detecting them going the other direction. These are competing. I ask you a question with noise in the background, which way are these objects moving on the screen? A bunch of dots moving around at random. And then we can study as a function of the noise level how quickly you can make a decision on these things going left or right. And so these processes, we're trying to develop now at Princeton models of how that decision process unfolds over time as a function of noise and what that would tell us about machine intelligence. And that's our collaboration with the Princeton Neuroscience Institute, as I mentioned. All right, so for all of those problems, to explore them, we need data sets and we need some kind of computational model. And so we're modeling it from a block diagram perspective like this. We give some type of task. It's presented to this dual or non-dual line brain with a data set. And we ask the question, what's present in the mind when the person is performing a task? And from that, what can we decode about how the brain works when it's undergoing some kind of task, whether it's a recall task or something else. And so there are two questions we have to answer, which are what are the data sets we use for this and what's the computational model that we can develop. And I'm going to give some examples around attention and get really specific with it. And in terms of data set, when you're dealing with humans, it's nice to have something really non-invasive. So although it's cumbersome and expensive and slow, we've been using functional fMRI. Functional fMRI is a little different than the kind you go and use when you go to the doctor, which gives you anatomical images. A functional fMRI, or an fMRI, gives you a time series of metabolic activity in the brain based on oxygen uptake of the neurons. And so we have a time course of a three-dimensional volume. I'll call the elements within that volume boxes from now on. And we can map it on an anatomical brain so we can understand what structures of the brain are relating to that metabolic activity. But this is really a data set that we can use to study people that are undergoing tasks in a scanner and even give them feedback. And in fact, so we've been training classifiers on that kind of data, putting someone under some kind of decision-making task, for example, and then from the imaging of the brain patterns, determining what class we think, what way they're going to go on a decision, or what they're paying attention to. And what we're interested in when developing classifiers and feature selection and all that for the brain are, first of all, what are the voxel locations, what are the activities, what are the behaviors over time, and the second thing is we want to understand how these things sew together into higher level networks. So if we abstract them up a level and feature, there are areas of the brain we're discovering that are specialized to identifying faces and identifying scenes and doing different processes that depend on the visual cortex or the auditory complex, but aren't that. And so we're also interested in the models, like global models of the brain that we get out of looking at a level that's higher than just the voxel level information. And from that, hopefully building a model of whatever this thing is that we call the mind, so that we can predict tasks, and then we can assess classification accuracy against the actual task, or conversely predict the brain imaging data. And so a system for doing that kind of study would look like this. You put someone in a scanner, you've got to do a ton of pre-processing on the image data. It's no surprise. Just like a lot of data science work, we spend 90–95% of our time trying to get the pre-processing right, just so we can get good results to a pretty straightforward classifier. And then what we would be interested in doing is training up these classifiers using certain experimental runs, and then switching modes to a new run where we ask them to then perform a task and then do the classification so we can update some kind of stimulus that's given to the person in the scanner. And this is what we call a closed loop experiment. This is something that's really hard to do in neuroscience today, but it would allow us to do causal experiments if we could do it fast enough. We actually change the stimulus based on what we see in the brain, the complete state that we see in the brain. And here's an example of one of those. So we could present to someone on a screen an image which is half scene, half face. And I'm trying to train your attention to one of these two things. So I'm not seeing it through your eyes. We're talking about the mental attention you're bringing to this image. And so if I want you to pay attention to the scene, when you are, I may reward you with more scene evidence, and I may fade out the other part of this task. But if I notice from your brain imaging data, implicit in the states, the hidden states that I see in the brain, if you're not paying attention to scene data, I may actually degrade that part of the image to push you forward with that, and to make you concentrate harder on it. So from this, we're hoping that there would be maybe a semi-permanent or some remaining effect on your ability to attend to things that you can test later after a number of these experiments. And of course, the classifier is helping us to determine on the brain imaging data what you're paying attention to. And so the way you would train that type of thing up is you would give a sequence of faces and scenes to the individual, and for each snapshot, these systems can process about a second or a second and a half per image. You would get a brain image, volume image, and you would give them a new face or scene every time that corresponds to that brain volume image. And then after you've got a sequence of images like that that correspond to the stimulus, you would train up your classifier and then do your decoding. And what Princeton was able to achieve before we reached them was, before we got involved in the work, and this was published in Nature Neuroscience, I believe, like a 78% cross-validation accuracy, which is really good. It's really good for this kind of thing. And they can do it really fast, and you can run the classifier after you've got this thing trained up. You can run this all on a MacBook Pro. It's quite easy. Here's an example of actually putting one of our scientists into the system. So this is actual mind reading. We're watching what the classifier is saying they're paying attention to. We instructed the scientists to pay attention in the scanner to scenes, but you can see they faded out. They're not doing a very good job. I see all face evidence here. But there's a little hook there. There's a little bit of scene left, so they can barely hook onto it. And we're hoping that they'll come back and keep concentrating to bring it back. And now you can see that we're getting evidence of brain decoding for scene. And it ends up, they drift back to scene. So to me, that was like the aha moment. I'm like, this is really interesting. You really can read people's minds in a very limited way. I mean, it's a binary classifier, but we're doing it in real time. And we'd like to generalize that. And of course, this isn't really what you're thinking, but we are able to see what you're attending to, and it's not coming out of the visual cortex. This is coming out of the face and place areas of the brain that are remote from that. So the answer is, the question of how close are we to brain decoding would be, well, in some sense, we're close. We've got meaningful clinical or research level accuracies on our classifiers. And if you take a good neuroscientist, you can actually identify the boxes of interest and put a mask on the brain and say, yeah, let's look at the activity here. This will indicate whether they're looking at a face or a place, which is cool if you have that kind of domain expertise. And we can do this stuff in real time with a limited number of boxes and with a low-dimensional classifier. But what we really want to do in the next 5 years with Princeton, started in January, so we're at the end of the first year, is get this up to accuracy that's unheard of with whether you're doing offline or online analysis. Label thousands of categories. We've set some really aggressive goals for ourselves for the next 2016 and 2017. We're going to hit 10 and 100. And you can imagine to get significant p-values for 100 classification states on that kind of data is going to be very challenging. And then we want to, I think one of the most important steps is to just take off these domain expert brain masks and discover what neuroscientists haven't seen by applying machine learning to the problem. So we want to do voxel selection and do voxel ranking based on how predictive these different sets of voxels are for an SVM classifier, for example. And do that all in a few minutes or even a few seconds. So, like I mentioned, we have a multi-year project that we're after. To do that, we've defined 3 years of it. We're leaving open what 4 and 5 will be based on what the initial research shows. But like I said, it mainly is about increasing the number of dimensions we're decoding and speeding up the system. And so I don't have a lot of time, and we started a little bit late, but I want to just present several challenges that we're dealing with and show you our progress to date. So one is, this is a super noisy data set. We'd love to get ideas about how to deal with this type of noisy data. The signals are so weak here that I'll show you in a minute an example of decoding, and you can see if you can look at the brain data and see the changes as it's decoding different things, but it's very hard to see. And it's also, the ground truth is very hard to get because we don't know what the person was really thinking about when we put them in the scanner, and you can't look at one of these images and go, they're looking at the face. Oh no, they're looking at that place. Oh, they're thinking about dog food or what they got to buy at the store. You just can't do that. Noisy data. There's a ton of noise sources. I have some of them listed. Some of them come from the system. Some of them come from the person in the scanner and the movement and so on. Some of them just come from the nature of the signal that we're recovering and autocorrelation to do with that. And then them just spacing out or doing other tasks that they shouldn't be doing when they're in the scanner. It's difficult to tease these things apart. On the right is actually an image. The white is noise, and this is a person that was undergoing just a standard task, and this is the noise. They were just repeating the task over and over, and we get this kind of noise. And we get a lot of drift over time, too, from the system and from the individual in it. So that's what an individual voxel activity actually looks like. That's what we're trying to decode on. But we're doing that for an entire brain volume, which is between 35,000 and 100,000 beats. And so there's really standard pre-processing pipelines to deal with that, but we're looking at some emerging strategies. So a standard pipeline would be shown on the right. We're looking at, of course, better quality filters. We've been using predictive filters. We've been looking at better noise models, and then maybe just throwing all that out. In fact, we've gotten some of our best classification accuracy by just throwing out all the filtering and letting the classifier see it all and using methods like topological data analysis to deal with the noise, or deep neural networks. And maybe that's the way we should go, and so we're exploring that right now. One of our early wins is submitted for publication, and that was we're using a type of factor analysis that is really a network-based radial basis function approach to dimensionality reduction of data. It also has the nice side effect of reducing noise in the data. But the hard part of that is picking the number of parameters. So how many factors should we actually use to represent this image data with the Gaussian process, for example. There's also a lot of challenges with scale of computation, as you can imagine. So we're going from like small masks of regions of the brain to the full brain data. And we need to look at the full brain data because as this shows here, which shows the correlation, these lines are correlations between the visual cortex and a part of the brain that decodes for a part of the cortex that decodes for face. And you can see that the correlations encode a lot of the information on face. So when the person's looking at face blocks, there's very positive correlations between these two regions, and when we're looking at scenes, it's very negative correlations. When people ignore that information, they lose a lot of the decoding performance. So we need to do not only activity level full brain analysis, but correlation analysis. And so we've been building pipelines to do this, that actually we build massive correlation matrices that that quickly compute all the correlations between one voxel and every other voxel in the brain. And then we do these automatic voxel selection processes based on SVM accuracy. And then we feed the selected voxels to an output stage, which is another SVM that uses that for the actual classification of image data. That would be an example of one pipeline we've developed that we've already published this year at this SC15 supercomputing conference because of all the computing required to get that done. And it's been doing a great job with the image data. And that's really the problem. I mean, it's taking a ton of parallelization to do this, and it's not easy for programmers to do that anymore, as you know. There's a lot of performance available in different compute architectures, and I won't go into this, but you can imagine Intel's got a great story around that. But a lot of speed up if you do it right. And so, for example, for the full correlation analysis, we turned that into a large matrix multiplication through some renormalization. And then, of course, for z-scoring, we also have to do z-scoring on the data, and there are really nice libraries for first doing some view parallelization of that across voxels, and also applying functions that are in kernel libraries for doing that fast. I'm sorry I'm ripping through this, but I'm really behind. And then we've also done a lot of tuning in the SVM classifier, both for just standard Intel architecture, but also coprocessors like Xeon Phi. But in general, just to understand how to build a really fast SVM that do this type of work. And I'm personally interested in incrementing and decrementing classifiers. I don't know if anybody has worked with a good decrementing classifier, but I'm very interested in kind of minimizing the processing required to train up and change SVM hyperplanes. So what we were able to achieve with all of that work that we did on this full correlation matrix analysis of the brain is we took two of the neuroscience data sets, this one called the face-seen data set and another one called the intentional data set. We got, as you can see with the little chart on the lower left chart, major speed up from our baseline, which is a pretty optimized baseline. We just hadn't applied full vectorization to it. And then we also tried this out on a Princeton HPC cluster, and we were able to speed it up as we added machines across the cluster and coprocessors. So the net result was that we went from those small masks that we had put on the brain to a full mask of the prefrontal cortex, and we were able to bring the k-fold cross-validation down to seconds from minutes, and achieve a higher classification accuracy on the same data sets. And so what we've been working on recently, which we have not published yet, but we're going to be submitting in mid-December, is a fully online cloud for doing this type of analysis. So if you have an MRI system anywhere in the world, you can connect to it on Amazon, for example, and you can stream imaging data in, and we will give you scored outputs right away. And we're developing a Python neuroscience toolbox that can also deploy with that kind of cluster or in a MacBook Pro, for example, and that can do this type of online selection, training, and classification, not just for the FACMA or the SCMA pipeline I described, but we are developing all kinds of pattern analysis pipelines with Princeton. We want to generalize the problem and make it very modular and interchangeable in terms of the filters you use and the classifiers you use and the selection, feature selection engineering methods you use. And so I just want to show that really quick, this real-time learning cloud. This is actually, I planned to demo it right off my machine here and read images straight from this machine, but I had a problem with my operating system compatibility. I need a new machine. But this is what it actually looks like when it's, we just recorded this yesterday. So our goal is, like I said, to we read these off machines in Portland and sent them to an HPC cluster at Princeton. And so I asked you if you could see differences in the scan images. So what you see is a brain slice right through the middle of the brain. This is functional fMRI. You should be able to see function levels. I bet you can. But on the input, it's every time the scan number changes down there, about every second and a half, that image is completely changing on the left. We're sending that up to the cloud, and then now are starting to come back classified images. So this is the image the person was looking at when we recorded the brain scan. And then the X, or the check, is whether the classifier agrees with the hidden labeled set or not. And so you can see the accuracy there, the red line being chance. Yes, it's very hard to do online methods that are better than chance. You can see that actually, I think by the end of the run, it gets around 73% accuracy, which is pretty good right now. And the processing time there, going from Portland through VPNs and then back to Princeton and then returning the result, is under 3 seconds per image there. You can see it running. So that's what we're trying to achieve. We'd like to do this, you can see where we've got a red line there at 1.5 seconds. Our goal is really to be able to score the change in stimulus against the brain image and return that before the next brain image is presented so we can make a decision on what to present next. And we're not there yet. We're about 2x above that. But when we started, we were at 78 seconds, and before that we were at over an hour. So we're making good progress since January on it, and I'm sure that before the end of the year we'll have it. So, decoding your thoughts, work in progress. Lots more basic neuroscience, lots better ways of dealing with the noise and machine learning speed and accuracy. And I think there's a lot we can do with this. Both, I haven't talked really about the clinical promise, but Princeton's got a whole set of studies lined up on depression. It's interesting that people that are depressed attend to things that when presented with images, they tend to really negative features of the images, and we can see that in the hidden state of the brain decoded images, even if they don't tell us what they're thinking about. So there are ways to provide real neurofeedback, not this kind of cheapy EEG neurofeedback, but real neurofeedback in the systems where we can actually train them to maybe be less depressed by giving them reinforcement to look at more positive features and things like that. So there's many studies like that we're interested in doing, and we're going to help them with the computer science part of it. With that, I'll take, if I have any time, which I probably don't, I can take a question. I don't have time. So if you have any questions, come see me after the last session. Thanks for your time.